Hey FlossTube, this is Brian, otherwise known as Split Stitch. Welcome back. This is my 5th video, and this video is going to be show and tell on how I stitch. I've had lots of requests from people to talk about how I stitch, to show how I stitch diagonally. I thought I'd do a video to explain how I do that, so I'm going to talk to you for a little while and show you, talk about my theory of cross stitch, and then I'm going to show you a video of me cross stitching a little bit, just to give you kind of an example of how I work. This video is a video version of a blog post that I have put up. So if you'd rather read text than watch a video, or vice versa, the link to that blog post is posted below. Also, some of the things that I'm going to talk about are things that I learned from a tutorial that was on the Scarlet Quince website, and I'll put a link to that tutorial below as well. I'm also going to reference a couple of videos that talk about how to park, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So in this first part of this video, I'm going to get a little bit technical, and I hope that I don't bore or confuse you too much, but I think I want to explain to you why I stitch a little bit, and that means getting a little bit technical. So first of all, I park my threads, and when I talk about parking my threads, that means I mark off a 100 stitch block in my design, and I stitch all of the stitches in that block. And if the color that I am stitching with is used in the next block that I'm going to be stitching, I will park my thread in the next block so that that thread will be available to use when I stitch the next block. One of the best tutorials that I know of on parking that is available on YouTube is Carolyn Mazzio's video, and I'm going to put a link to that below if you want to see specifically how she parks. That's very close to how I park, especially when I'm working 1/1 design like my Autumn Magic. I work that way. There's another tutorial on parking by a Russian YouTuber, and her channel name is Lenali Stitching and Crafts, and she parks kind of row by row, and that's similar to what I do when I'm doing a design where I'm working with 2 threads. So I'll put the link to that video below as well, and she does some things that are a little bit obsessive, as far as I think that the way that she stitches would make her back look a little bit neater than what I do. But kind of some of the same concepts that she talks about are some of the same concepts that I use. Now, why do I like to park? I like to park because it helps me stitch quickly and efficiently. There was a time when I just stitched cross country, and I found that on complicated designs, I'd spend most of my time counting and making sure that I didn't make mistakes, and not really stitching. And parking, because I work 100 stitch block at a time, I find that I don't need to count quite as much, and I can stitch more than count. Also, if I make a mistake, my mistake becomes rather obvious rather quickly that I have made a mistake. And so if I ever do have to frog any stitches, it's usually only a few stitches rather than ending up having to frog a great big huge block of stitches. I don't really have a lot of patience for having to take out a bunch of stitches. Also, another reason why I like to park is it reduces the number of decisions that I have to make. When I used to stitch, I used to have to decide, okay, what area am I going to stitch in the design, and what color am I going to use? And I got to a point where I got so burned out, it's like I don't like that color, I don't like that part of the design, I want to stitch somewhere else. And I've decided that part of the reason why I got burned out is all of the decisions that I had to make. There is research about willpower talking about how we exercise our willpower by making lots of decisions. And the more decisions we make, the less willpower that we have. And I have found in my own life that if I put into place a system that makes it so that I don't have to make decisions, then my willpower stays high and my motivation stays high and I continue to do stuff. So parking for me is a system that reduces the number of decisions that I have to make and makes it so that I can work better. So that's why I like to park. Now the second part of this is I stitch diagonally. And the reason why I stitch diagonally is, first of all, I think it looks kind of cool. I think it's kind of fun to see the design develop that way. Another reason why I like to do that is I think it gives me more variety in my stitching. As I work along the diagonal, there's more variety in the design than if I were to work in columns. Also, at one time I was working in columns, and if you work in columns with straight lines, I noticed that I was starting to get faint lines in my design from doing that, and working diagonally is a way to avoid putting lines in your final finished project. And the final reason is it's another system that I use to make my stitches neater. So, and I'm going to talk about that. That's where I'm going to get a little bit technical, is I'm going to talk about why my stitches are neater when I do this. Now, there are a couple of disadvantages to parking and to working this way. One of those disadvantages is the back of your project may not be as neat as you would like. That doesn't really bother me. I don't care if I have threads floating across the back of my project all that much. If you are concerned about how neat your back looks, then parking may not be the correct method for you to use. Another thing that happens with stitching diagonally is as you go along, you start down in one corner, and as you move along, your diagonals are going to get longer and longer and longer. And you may get to a point where your diagonals don't fit don't fit completely on your hoop or your Q-snap or your scroll bar, and you may have to adjust things as you move down your diagonal. I'm getting to that point in a couple of my designs. It doesn't really bother me because I use scroll bars, and it's just easy to rotate the scroll bars a couple of turns and reposition my design. If I can understand if you like to work with a Q-snap, you might find having to move your Q-snap all the time to be kind of a pain. And finally, this method really works best with full coverage designs. If you work on designs that have really small motifs with a lot of negative space, then this doesn't make a lot of sense. And I have a couple of designs where I'm not parking because it just doesn't work because there's so much space in between the motifs that I'm stitching. Okay, so getting that out of the way, I want to talk about why the way I stitch makes my stitches neater. And first of all, the first thing is something that I learned from experience, a couple of experiences. I found that everything looks better if I make my stitches all the same way. And I learned that the hard way. I'm going to show you a piece. This is the first piece that I ever stitched on linen. It's an English cottage, and this was from a design in the Leisure Arts magazine in the early 90s. I'll put the information below. And I don't know if you can see this because of the glare, but on the roof of this cottage there's this great big huge block that's all the same color. And when I stitched this block, I started over in this corner and I stitched one column after another. And I got to a point where I was bored stitching in columns, and I thought, oh, I'm just going to start stitching horizontally. And so I started stitching this way, right about here. And if you can, I don't know if you can see it, but the area that I stitched horizontally different from the area that I stitched vertically. And so there's a definite line in there where I changed direction. At the time I noticed it, but I didn't want to take everything out, and it didn't bother me that as much. But now that I look at that, that's a reminder to me that I want to stitch all of my stitches the same way as much as I can. That just makes everything more uniform, I think, because stitching horizontally looks different than stitching vertically. And I don't know why that is, but it may be the way that you're pulling the thread on the back. I don't know, but that's the way it is. The second thing I've learned over time is that I don't want to elongate the legs of my crosses. And I have this diagram that kind of explains what I'm talking about. If I were to stitch this stitch and stitch the last leg from the bottom to the top, and then carry that thread underneath to start this stitch up here, what I've done is the thread being carried back in the same direction that I finished this stitch in is going to elongate that cross, and it's going to make it so that leg is just a little bit longer than the other legs of the cross. The other thing that happens here is you're covering up, if this is the first stitch that you've made, you're covering up the hole that this stitch goes down through, and that's going to make it harder for you to make the other stitches around these stitches here, because you've covered up this hole. And I've got a lot of places. It took me a long time to figure out why I was seeing places where I have longer legs, and this is one of the reasons why. So the way that I stitch now guarantees that I will be always pulling the thread that I'm carrying back across the stitch so that I don't elongate my legs. So if I were to stitch this again, the way to stitch this correctly would be to stitch this cross this way, and then start this stitch down here. That pulls the thread back this way and keeps that cross from being elongated. So that's one thing to do to avoid elongating your legs. The second thing is something that I learned from the Scarlet Quince website tutorial on parking. And the whole point of that tutorial on parking is not dividing your design up into 100 stitch blocks and stitching. The whole point of that is park to help make your stitches look neater and more uniform. And I would really, if you haven't read that tutorial, I would really encourage you to read that, because there's a lot of information there. I'm going to kind of summarize what it says here. So what that tutorial says is that it is easier to bring your needle up in a hole that is empty, and easier to put it down in a hole that already has a lot of threads in it. And the reason why is you want to make sure that you bring the thread up in an area where you're not crossing the other threads that are already in that hole. So as an example, this diagram here, no, this one over here. So it is a lot easier to come up in this hole where there's no stitches than it is to come up in this hole, because there's already three stitches in this hole, and you can kind of see that the hole is a lot smaller here than here, and you've got to get your needle up in that little teeny tiny hole. And it's just easier to put your needle down in that hole than to bring it back up. You can, and if you've got two stitches that are on top of each other, then you can still bring your needle up in this hole. This is pretty easy to do. But I've also noticed that if you have two stitches that are diagonally, you've got two small holes on either side here. And so it is a lot easier to bring up your needle up in a hole like this, where you've got two stitches vertically, than it is to bring your needle up in this hole. So and what you want to really avoid is you want to avoid a situation like this where you need to make a stitch where all the stitches around it are completed. And the reason why is you've got three places where you've already got 3 threads, and then you have this situation here where you've got this small hole. It is going to be very difficult to make a stitch in here and make it look really neat. So the way I stitch, I have a rule when I stitch. And that rule is that I never make this stitch. If I'm working this way, I don't make this stitch until this stitch is made. So I never put a stitch in when there's an empty stitch next to it that needs to be stitched when I'm working this way, okay? So that's why the way I stitch helps make things neater. And I have noticed that since I have started following that rule and stitching diagonally, which does this all for me automatically, that my stitches are a lot neater. And I really like how things look. I don't see any legs that pop out at me and bug me. So this has really helped me make my stitches neater. So I want to just briefly go along, talk about how I stitch diagonally a little bit more. And I'm going to talk about how I start a design and how I decide how I'm going to stitch. So when I decide how to stitch, the first thing I decide is I look at my design and I decide what corner I'm going to start in. And I usually start in the lower left-hand corner just because I like to think that way. I like to think moving left to right. There may be a design that I see where I decide I want to start in a different corner. Okay, so based on where I'm going to start on the design, now I need to decide how I'm going to make my stitches. And I have a diagram that explains this. And this is available on my blog post. If you want to take a look at this closely, you can go to the blog post. First of all, you have to look at which way you make your stitches. I make my stitches this way. And I said I want to start down in this corner. Now when I stitch diagonally, I'm not really thinking about stitching an entire diagonal. What I think about is stitching one column or one row at a time, and the next column is just offset by one stitch all the way up. So I think of stitching in rows or columns. And and when I talk about that, I mean I start at one end of the column and I make half stitches down, and then I finish the column going back up. And then I go to the next one and go down, up, down, up. So, and you can stitch in columns or you can stitch in rows. And generally I think of stitching in columns, so I generally stitch in columns. So the arrows on the side are the direction that you stitch if you want to stitch in columns, and the arrows top and bottom are if you're going to stitch in rows. So if I'm starting down in this corner and the arrow is pointing down, that means that I am going to stitch by making half stitch down the column, and then I'm going to complete the crosses going back up. If I were stitching in rows, then I would start and I would make half stitches going across this way and then complete the crosses going back. And then this little dot in the corner, that tells me what corner of the cross I'm going to start with. So this says I'm going to park in the upper right corner. And that's also where I'm going to start the stitches. So I'm going to go from upper right to lower left all the way down, and then I'm going to come back and go from lower right to upper left all the way back up. What that does, what you're really doing is you're making sure that your needle is always coming up in an empty space. The column next to your needle, to this side of your needle, is going to be empty, and you're always going to be going down into right next to a column that you've already stitched. Okay, so based on which way you make your crosses and where you want to start and whether or not you work in diagonals, this will tell you how to make your crosses. Okay, so now I know how I'm going to make my crosses. Now I need to find where to start. And one of the things that I do to make sure that I don't orient my fabric incorrectly or start on fabric that's too small is I find the middle of my fabric and then I count down to the corner where I'm going to start. And the way I count is I just count over to the side and I use pins to mark every 10 stitches. I generally make that match the bold lines and the bold lines every other 10 lines in the chart. I put pins to match that all the way across to the side, and that way I can easily count. So I just count 10 stitches, place a pin, 10 stitches, place a pin, all the way across, and then I do the same thing going down. That helps me find my corner. And once I find my corner, then I start stitching down there. That guarantees that I will have enough fabric for the entire design. If I start counting and I run out of fabric, or if my corner ends up not quite where I expect it to be, that means that there's probably a problem that I need to figure out how to fix before I start stitching. Okay, so then when I start stitching, I mark the first diagonal on my chart. So this is kind of an example chart. Let's say this is a 20 by 20, a design that's 20 by 20. I mark my first diagonal. I just highlight the diagonal on my chart. Okay, and then I'm going to stitch all these stitches in this little triangle here. This triangle is 55 stitches, and generally, like I say, I tend to concentrate in columns, so I'm going to stitch one column after another. If I were to do rows, then I'd be working this way, from the bottom to the top. So, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more about how I stitch a column in a minute. Okay, so there is, after I finish stitching that triangle, I highlight it as done, and then I mark the next diagonal. So this time I'm going to be stitching this parallelogram. There's 100 stitches in that parallelogram. So after I stitch that parallelogram, I highlight it as complete, and I stitch the next triangle, the next diagonal. I highlight this next diagonal. So now I'm going to stitch another triangle. Now, if your design were bigger, you'd end up stitching, on the next diagonal, you'd end up stitching 2 parallelograms and then a triangle. And you'd be stitching more and more parallelograms until you hit one of the corners. And then when you hit one of the corners, your diagonals are going to be the same length until you hit the other corner. And when you hit the other corner, then your diagonals are going to start shrinking. Anyway, so I finished this. It's highlighted as done. Now I need to stitch this triangle. There's nothing to highlight on this one, but I'm gonna finish stitching this one. Mark it as done, and then that's highlighted in yellow. It's pretty hard to see, but I highlight the next diagonal. I stitch that diagonal, and what is left is to stitch the upper triangle. So that is how I move through the design. Like I say, I really like doing that. I like the way the design develops that way. Now I'm going to talk about how I stitch, make my individual stitches. And basically the rule that I do is I choose a color and I stitch that color in each column until I can't stitch anymore. Either I finish all of that color in the area that I'm stitching, or the other thing that'll happen is I'll get to a point where the stitch next to it is not stitched, and so I'm going to have to wait till that stitch gets stitched. So this is an example chart. This is just one little. I copied this out of an old magazine. It's not even a design I'm stitching. So if you can figure out what this chart is, you're really gifted. But so let's say that I had to stitch this 10 by 10 block in here. And I'm only going to step you through stitching the first triangle here. So the first thing I do is I highlight my diagonal. So that's what I'm going to stitch. Now, sometimes charts don't start with on a bold line like this. Sometimes they're over a little bit. And as a rule, I always want my diagonal to go between my bold lines in a 10 by 10 block. So if there's stitches over here or down here, I will just extend my diagonal and stitch it. I want to make this as easy as possible to mark this diagonal all the time. So sometimes my first column will have 3 or 4 more stitches over here. I just adjust things so I'm always stitching across that way diagonally. Okay, so it's highlighted, and now I've decided, looking at this, I decide that probably the best thing to do would be to stitch this color with the slash here. So, and that I can actually stitch all of that color in this triangle. So I'm going to stitch column by column all the way across. When I get over here, I'm only going to stitch 2 here and 1 here. And then when I'm finished, there's 2 things I can do. I can end off my thread, or I can say, well, I'm just going to keep stitching this same color, and I can park in this. Sometimes I'll park in this. It depends on what I want to do. I generally prefer parking down my diagonal rather than outside of the diagonal, because if I park outside the diagonal, then I've got this thread flopping around that I pick up later. But sometimes the way my colors run, it just makes me want to continue to do that. So it kind of depends on the design where I park. Okay, so I finished this. Now I look at this and I think, okay, the next stitch in this column here is this M. So I'm going to stitch this M. Okay, so I stitch all the M's, but when I get over here, I have an M that's next to a 4 that hasn't been stitched. So I'm going to park my thread here. I'm not going to stitch all of these M's until this 4 gets stitched. So after I've done my M's, I decide I'm going to do my 4s. And you'll notice I get here, and then I have a 4 that's stitched next to an unstitched piece. So I am going to park my thread on this 4. And then I look at this and I think, okay, now I can stitch the carrots. And I can stitch all of the carrots in this triangle. And once again, I could park here, or I could end it off. You know, it just depends on what I want to do. But now that all the carrots are stitched, I can finish stitching my 4s. And then I can finish stitching the M's. That's kind of, you know, with the design where you've got a lot of confetti, that kind of gets to be a pain. I've tried keeping live needles to reduce the time it takes to thread a needle, but I haven't figured out how to do that without having my threads kind of tangle a little bit, and then I have to take time to, when I pick up a thread that I already have, I have to take time to kind of untangle it. And so I've just gotten really good at threading needles. I work with one needle and I just continually thread. And I've gotten really good at it. It doesn't really bother me as much as it did when I first started stitching this way. So, you know, that's another thing is you may feel if you get a block that's really confetti heavy, you're going to be threading needles a lot and it's going to be a pain. And that's part of the reason with when I stitch 1 over 1, my threads, I don't really follow that. I just stitch all of the color in the block that I'm stitching, partly because I don't think that there's as much of a risk of splitting stitches when you've only got 1 thread. And also, the threads are so small, the squares are so small that it's really hard to even see legs, let alone see legs that are longer. And so, and also, like my Autumn Magic, it's so confetti heavy, I can't imagine. So with Autumn Magic, I just stitch all of the colors in that block. But with my other pieces where I'm stitching with 2 threads, I've been doing this, and I really like the results. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of how I stitch. I'm going to insert a video now that is showing me stitching a block on my winter sampler. Now, I've really struggled finding something to film because having things just line up right, and either my blocks are too complicated or too easy. This is a pretty easy block, but it shows some of the things that I do. And just as a warning, you're going to see me make mistakes and undo them and fix them as well, because I had a hard time seeing the holes because I was set at an angle from my fabric, and I made a couple of counting errors. And I thought about editing them out, and I thought, oh, you can just see me warts and I'll make my mistakes. So anyway, I'm going to show you this video. There's a little bit of running commentary that I use to talk about what I'm doing, and I'll insert that video here. Okay, so I'm going to stitch this area right here. That's going to finish up the pendulum, and then I'm going to start more of this ski scene down here. And it looks like I'm actually going to get a little bit of snow the first section of the skiing vignette. So that is the only color there. I'll actually use it again lower down, but I'm not going to carry it that far because it's being carried, it'd be carried over blank space, so we'll just save that for later. And then I'm going to park this right here because I have one more stitch in this. Whoops. Because I have one more stitch in this color to do for the pendulum, but I don't want to start and stop that color when I come down the next time, just for one stitch. Okay, and then a couple of half stitches. Park that for the next time I come down the diagonal. Okay, there. Now my pendulum is finished, or that part of the pendulum's finished. So now I have a bunch of blank space in here, and I need to start something up here, but in order to make sure I don't make any counting errors, I'm going to start with this red border. So, and this is just going to go, let's see, I need okay. Now I'm not going to make that stitch because there's a stitch that goes right there in a different color. So what I'm going to do is now I think I can count up to know where I want to start. It is really hard for me to see the holes from this angle. 1, 2, 3, I believe. Well, I hope that's right. I guess we'll find out if it's not. Oh, it's wrong. We want to start counting from here. 1, 2. Oh man. Actually, what I'm going to do is, because I'm going to end up parking this thread up on top rather than work down, and then moving, having a great big huge strand to park. I'm just going to go this way. And if I complete the crosses like this as I go, then I'm still starting my X's on the same side. And I am going to cross this one this way so that I don't elongate my leg. Same for this one. And then, there. Had a knot that I had to pull out. Okay, so now we're going to stitch with this color, and I can do the entire color in the diagonal because it all sits right up against what I stitched before. Whoops. That one came up in the wrong hole. So it's hard for me to see the holes because I'm sitting at an angle to make room for the tripod that holds my camera, or I should say my phone. So okay. And then I pull this down, this thread down, because I have to come up in that same hole that I'm parked in. And for now, I'm just going to park right there. And then I need to do park up there for the next time I come down the diagonal. Now I can finish this red border. Oh, another battle. Okay, now let's pull this out of the way. And that is the end of my 100 stitch block. So I'm going to just park there for now. When I start my next block, I'll do that. So now, let's see here. I happen to have, this is the same color that was in the pendulum. I happen to have it parked already. So I ended up not needing that. So we'll park that there for the next time I stitch. And I just have a couple more stitches to do and I'll be finished with this. Okay. And this, I need to do a quarter stitch. And generally when I do quarter stitches like this, I do the quarter stitches that match the direction I'm stitching. So I'm coming down and doing this. This isn't a good example, but and that needs to be parked right there. Oops. So there is not very many stitches in that block, but that's a good idea of how I stitch. You saw how I fixed some, how I tackled some things. You'll notice I don't always keep to my rules. If I find that I need to break them in order to do something, I will do that. You've seen it, but I'll show you again. This is just an example. This is what my back looks like. I'll show you my back. And you'll see that, so this is my back, and you'll see where I've got big blocks of color. That's what it looks like. It's pretty neat. It's only where I get a lot of confetti, like over here. You get a lot of floaters coming across. But this is actually looks pretty good to me. My automatic piece, the back is just a nightmare because there's so much confetti. But so that's how it looks. So the next time I stitch, I'm going to stitch this. It's going to be her head and more of this yellow background. So that's exciting. I am almost finished with this diagonal. And we'll be able to see something new. I'll be glad to get this diamond finished. But there it is. Okay, so that's that's an example of how I stitch. If there's any interest, I may make more of those videos just of me stitching with maybe a little bit of running commentary. I don't know. But to kind of give you an idea of how I stitch in different situations. So that's the end of my show and tell. I hope that it has been informative to you and that it has been helpful. Of course, you can take or leave what I say and do. It's up to you. I'm not dictating that this is the way that you need to stitch. This is the way that I stitch, and it is the way that I have found to be able to stitch quickly, efficiently, and with few mistakes, with uniform, neat stitches. You may have a different way that you prefer to do. That's fine with me. But I hope that you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to make those in the comments below. I will try to answer any questions that you have to the best of my ability. And thanks for watching. Feel free, if you haven't, to subscribe. I plan on doing an update video in a couple of weeks. So if you want to see that, feel free to subscribe. And thanks so much. We'll talk to you later. Goodbye.